The mornings are still silvered with frost, but the snowdrops have risen. Their small bells nod in the pale light of dawn, and the hellebores unfurl in their muted purples and greens, shyly, as if reluctant to reveal their secrets. It is the threshold season here in the dark Antipodean south, one foot in winter, one in spring, a time of beginnings but also of reckoning. And so, as the light returns, I find myself deep in a difficult, miraculous labour of love. Not journaling, not sketching ideas in the margins, but attempting the impossible, my first novel. And my dearest wildflowers, it's harder than I thought. Not that I expected ease, but with a degree in literature and a few non-fiction books behind me, I assumed it would be at least survivable. Next thing I know, I'm tearing my hair out. But don't worry, I'm not here to terrify you, at least not until you read the actual novel. What I want to share is the maddening and marvellous ride so far, and maybe hear from other writers. Which parts of the process leave you clawing at the wallpaper? My project, working title Project Magdalena, is what I'll call a literary Gothic. Not Gothic as in rattling chains and ruined abbeys, but Gothic in the modern literary sense. Isolation and landscape as character, madness and instability, the uncanny body, obsession and grief, the classic Gothic engine since the 18th century. I'm not pastiching the genre so much as stealing its DNA to interrogate contemporary obsessions. Gender, masking, neurodivergence, female rage, all while trying to keep the literary mantle. Layered, precise, voice-driven prose. If I'm lucky, maybe one day a critic will shelve it as literary Gothic. It's just a wee bit ambitious. So where did I stumble? Yeah, around the 40,000 word mark, about 100 pages in, when I reached the end of the first act and realised chapter 1 was complete rubbish. The kind of rubbish that makes you sweat at the thought of an agent ever reading it. That was my first major reckoning. But the good news is I learned that even the most experienced writers will often go back and rewrite their chapter 1. In fact, many writers prefer to write their opening chapter at the end when everything else is finished. So I got back to work, and I'll be honest, I'm still working on it. Just trying not to go slowly insane. So yes, that was my first rude awakening. Chapter 1 wasn't singing, it was stuttering. But that was hardly the only stumble. Just when I thought chapter 1 was my biggest disaster, the universe handed me a fresh humiliation. Coffee hot, highlighter in hand, I stumbled upon not one but two gleeful takedowns of Ocean Vuong's On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, which, of the 70 or so books I've read this year, came near the top. I thought it was brilliant. The critics, however, weren't content to just dislike his style. They called him illiterate. Illiterate. This for a writer who has won the T.S. Eliot Prize, the Whiting Award, a Genius Grant, and teaches creative writing at NYU. Apparently none of that counts if your sentences dare to be beautiful. Reading that right when I was knee-deep in my first round of edits was like being handed a death sentence. What if my own so-called poetic prose was just purple landfill waiting to be mocked? Cue me, 2 a.m. in a cold sweat, thinking that every adjective in my novel needed to be slashed. And while I was pretty ruthless with my own writing after reading those essays, I have to say, in the end, I decided that what's wrong with a bit of poetry? I do love a little bit of lyricism. And so to heck with those mean critics, I'm keeping the poetic parts, the parts that I think Ocean would approve of. Next, the headache of tense accuracy. When you've got a first-person narrator situated in a known place, speaking in present tense at both the beginning and the end, and sometimes throughout, but the middle is riddled with memories nested within memories, deliberately ambiguous chronology, and eternal truth asides, well, it becomes a nest of snakes. Half the time I felt like a lawyer, not an editor, when I was making my first round of revisions. But I managed to wrap my head around it, I think, and I'm confident about one thing, and that's if I can pull it off, it's going to be a narrative tour de force. The next stumbling block, or maybe skill I learnt the hard way, was about voice consistency. Because by the time I reached chapter 7, I realised my protagonist's voice was so much stronger, sharper, stranger and more assured than it had been in chapter 1. In fact, her personality was more solid. She was more interesting and kind of cool. So I had to go back and make sure that this character really spoke with that voice from the very first line. She needs to grab your attention and tell you who she is in that first chapter, which was again extremely tough. Another thing I realized at this point was that I was a better writer by chapter 7. So much better. Of course, that was a bittersweet revelation. It showed me that the progress was real, but it left the earlier chapters looking like they needed reconstructive surgery. No mind, I can do this. Finally, maybe the biggest thing I have bitten off and I am still chewing on is this idea of metafiction. Who in their right mind decides 40,000 words in that they want to play with the idea of metafiction? Me, that's who. But not metafiction with a wink. No sly fourth wall break. I wanted to explore self-conscious narration as a haunted house in its own right. A voice aware of its scaffolding, but still desperate to keep performing. So you can imagine the migraine that gave me in revision. And I don't know if there's even a formula for this. It's sort of so outside the box. And it's really so typical of me to do something so impossible on my first shot. Anyway, all of which to say, the first draft didn't collapse, but it lurched, it buckled. It forced me to face some hard truths about writing a novel, but in the end, I feel it makes it all worthwhile. Why attempt it at all if it's not going to be a challenge, right? I want to create something that I would want to read. I want to express something deep and meaningful and unique to me. So, wish me luck. In the end, surprise, surprise, writing a novel really is harder than I thought. But you know what's harder than that? Reading one more of these hateful clickbait articles about how poetic prose is overwrought without throwing my coffee across the room. And if you'd like the spicier version of my thoughts on this, you can find it in my Substack essay, Wong's Not Crying, He's Dancing on Your Hate Bait, which I'll link in the description below. You'll also find more dispatches from a novelist in metamorphosis, that's me, and take a peek at some of my essays on the macabre joys of writing. I'll argue with critics, dissect the monstrous feminine, and generally refuse to write prose like a corporate mission statement. All the glamorous stuff they don't tell you about in MFA brochures. Now tell me, wildflowers, what's your hard truth about writing? Or better yet, what criticism have you used as fuel?